wasn't supposed to be a solo trip. Originally, my older brother Mason was supposed to come along, but last-minute work commitments left me heading out alone in the RV we'd spent months renovating together. The idea was to test it on a weekend camping trip in the foothills of southern Alberta, where we used to camp as kids. The drive out was smooth. I'd stocked up on groceries, packed some fishing gear, and brought a couple of Mason's old books for company. The RV, a sturdy but aged vehicle we'd affectionately named the Tank, handled the narrow dirt roads better than I expected. By late afternoon, I'd found a secluded spot near a small lake and parked with the rear doors facing the water. It felt perfect, peaceful, quiet, and just distant enough from civilization. I spent the evening fishing, catching nothing but enjoying the stillness. As the sun dipped below the hills, I set up a small fire outside and grilled a quick dinner. I kept thinking how Mason would have loved this spot. I even considered texting him a picture, but there was no signal. Instead, I sat by the fire, soaking in the solitude. It was around midnight when I woke up to a sharp noise. At first, I thought it was a dream. Then I heard it again, a metallic clang, like something hitting the side of the RV. My mind immediately went to wildlife. Bears or coyotes, maybe. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and peered out the side window. Nothing. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, and the trees stood motionless. I decided it was probably just a tree branch brushing the RV and went back to bed, but I couldn't shake the unease. The silence outside felt too heavy, as if the night itself was holding its breath. The next morning, I stepped outside to find something strange. On the ground near the rear of the RV was a pair of scuff marks in the dirt. They were faint but distinct, as if something heavy had been dragged across the ground. I checked the back of the RV, thinking maybe I'd accidentally left something unsecured, but everything was as I'd left it. The unease from the night before crept back in, but I convinced myself it was nothing. Determined not to let paranoia ruin the trip, I spent the day exploring the trails around the lake. I even found an old wooden dock hidden among the trees, half sunken but still intact enough to sit on. By the time I returned to the RV, the sun was setting again, painting the sky in hues of orange and red. I made dinner and told myself I was overthinking things. That night, the noise came back. This time, it was different. A low, rhythmic sound, almost like a hum, echoed faintly through the air. It wasn't coming from the RV, but seemed to drift from somewhere in the woods. I stood by the door, flashlight in hand, debating whether to investigate. "It's probably the wind," I muttered to myself, though the air was still. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay there, every sound amplified in the quiet. Just as I began to drift off, there was a sudden thud against the side of the RV. I bolted upright, heart pounding. The flashlight beam darted around the small interior as I tried to calm myself. "It's fine," I whispered, gripping the flashlight tightly. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When it did, I stepped outside, scanning the area for any signs of what might have caused the noise. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. Faint scratches on the side of the RV near the back door. They were shallow but deliberate, as if someone had dragged a sharp object across the paint. I packed up quickly, my excitement for the trip completely gone. As I pulled back onto the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The lake and trees blurred into the distance, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was leaving more than just a campsite behind. Back home, I told Mason about the trip. He laughed, teasing me for getting spooked, but even he paused when I mentioned the scratches. "Maybe next time we'll stick to campgrounds," he said, half joking. I nodded, but I knew there wouldn't be a next time for that spot. Some places, I've come to believe, carry a weight that's better left undisturbed. Last summer, my wife Liana and I decided to take our RV out for a weekend trip. We'd recently bought it, a second-hand Class C camper, and had spent weeks fixing it up together. Liana had always been the adventurous type, and this trip was her idea. Just the two of us, no schedules, no distractions, she'd said, her enthusiasm contagious. We set out early Friday morning, heading for a spot she'd found online, a quiet lakeside clearing deep in northern Ontario. The drive was beautiful, the scenery changing from bustling towns to sprawling forests and glimmering lakes. By the time we arrived, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the water. We parked the RV in a small clearing right by the lake, surrounded by dense trees. The first evening was perfect. We grilled dinner on a portable barbecue, laughed over old stories, and watched the stars come out. It felt like we were the only two people in the world. The next day, we decided to explore the area. We followed a narrow trail that wound through the forest, Liana leading the way with her boundless energy. The trail looped back to the lake, where we spent the afternoon swimming and fishing. By evening, we were back at the RV, tired but happy. After dinner, we sat outside, watching the moonlight dance on the water. That's when we heard it. A faint, distant sound. At first, it was hard to make out, but it grew louder, a low, rhythmic thud that seemed to echo through the forest. "What is that?" Liana asked, her brow furrowing. I shrugged, trying to play it off. Probably a tree branch falling or something. She nodded, but didn't look convinced. The sound faded after a few minutes, and we went back to talking, though the mood had shifted slightly. Later that night, after we'd gone to bed, I woke up suddenly. The RV felt eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. Then I heard it again, the thud. This time, it was closer, and it felt heavier, as if something substantial had fallen nearby. Liana stirred beside me. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, grabbing the flashlight we'd left by the bed. "Stay here," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I stepped outside, the cool night air hitting me instantly. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and the RV's surroundings. Nothing seemed out of place. The lake was calm, the forest still, but that unease I'd felt earlier lingered. As I walked around the RV, I noticed something strange near the back, a single large branch lying on the ground. It wasn't there earlier, and it didn't look like it had fallen naturally. The break was too clean, almost like it had been placed there. I shined the flashlight around again, scanning the trees. Nothing. No movement, no sounds, just the oppressive silence of the forest. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. Liana was sitting up, her eyes wide. "What was it?" she asked. "A branch," I said, sitting beside her. "Probably the wind." She nodded, but neither of us slept much that night. The next morning, we decided to cut the trip short. As we packed up, Liana found something that made my stomach drop. A series of small, neatly stacked stones by the edge of the lake. They weren't there the day before. "Do you think someone else is camping nearby?" she asked. I didn't have an answer. We finished packing in record time and drove away, the RV bouncing over the uneven dirt road. Neither of us spoke much on the drive home. We haven't talked about that trip since. The RV sits in our driveway, untouched, and every time I see it, I think about that night. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just the wind, a coincidence, a trick of the mind. Or maybe some places are meant to stay undisturbed. The RV trip was supposed to be a bonding experience. My best friend Callan and I had been talking about it for years, renting a camper, hitting the open road, and leaving all responsibilities behind for a week. The plan was simple: drive out to the Rockies, find a few scenic spots, and just exist for a while. But things took an unexpected turn on the second night. We had parked at a remote campsite near a lake. It wasn't an official campground, just a pull-off we found while following a logging road deep into the forest. The spot was beautiful, tucked between tall pines, with the water glistening under the moonlight. There was no one else around, and the silence felt like a luxury after years of city noise. The first night went smoothly. We cooked dinner on the portable stove, played cards under the awning, and stayed up late, talking about everything and nothing. The air was crisp, the kind of cool that makes you feel alive. By the time we went to bed, I was already planning to suggest staying an extra day. The next morning, we decided to explore the area. Callan wanted to fish, and I was content to wander along the lake's edge, taking photos and soaking in the solitude. By early afternoon, we were back at the RV, sitting in camping chairs and lazily planning dinner. That's when we saw him. A man emerged from the forest, walking slowly along the edge of the lake. He was carrying a fishing pole, his clothes worn and dusty. At first glance, he seemed harmless, just another person enjoying the outdoors. But as he got closer, something about him felt off. Maybe it was the way he didn't seem to notice us, or the strange rhythm of his steps, like he wasn't in any hurry to get anywhere. "Hey there," Callan called out, raising a hand in greeting. The man stopped, finally looking our way. His face was hard to read, partially obscured by the brim of a wide hat. After a long pause, he nodded, then continued walking, his gaze lingering on the RV as he passed. Neither of us said anything for a moment, but the atmosphere had shifted. "Probably just a local," I said, trying to brush it off. Callan nodded, but he didn't look convinced. "Let's keep an eye out, just in case." That evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, I noticed something odd. The fishing pole Callan had propped against the RV was gone. At first I thought he'd moved it, but he insisted he hadn't touched it. We searched the area, thinking it might have fallen over or been dragged by the wind, but there was no sign of it. "Maybe an animal took it," Callan suggested, though neither of us really believed that. The unease from earlier returned, stronger this time. We decided to lock up the RV and call it a night, agreeing to leave first thing in the morning. But sleep didn't come easily. Every sound outside felt amplified, every creak of the RV's frame like a warning. Around midnight, I heard it, the faint crunch of gravel, followed by the soft rustle of movement near the rear of the RV. My heart raced as I nudged Callan awake. "Someone's outside," I whispered. We stayed silent, listening intently. The sound came again, closer this time. Callan grabbed a flashlight and gestured for me to stay put as he crept toward the door. Against my better judgment, I followed him, the tension thick in the confined space. When Callan opened the door and shined the flashlight out into the clearing, we saw nothing. The night was still, the lake reflecting the moonlight like glass. But as we stepped outside, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A line of footprints circling the RV, fresh and deliberate. "Whoever it was, they were just here," Callan muttered, his voice low. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, we packed up and left, the tires kicking up dirt as we sped back to the main road. Neither of us spoke much during the drive, the weight of what had happened settling in the silence. When we stopped at a gas station hours later, Callan went to fill the tank while I stepped out to stretch my legs. That's when I noticed it, the missing fishing pole, propped neatly against the back of the RV. It hadn't been there when we left. I called Callan over, and we stared at it, both of us too unnerved to say anything. We left it there and drove the rest of the way home without stopping. To this day, we don't know who that man was or why he came back, but every time I think about that trip, I'm reminded of how quickly the open road can turn from freedom to something far more unsettling.